Hello, everybody. You have tuned in to Eric Jose on Making a Murderer on YouTube. I cover virtually any aspect of making a murderer. I go over the evidence, the documents, the photos. So if you like, stay tuned, and in the future I'll have many more videos besides the one you're about to see. Hello, everybody out there, all the Making a Murderer, researchers and sympathizers and supporters, all of you, Today's a day we've been waiting for. Finally, Zellner filed. Zellnami incoming. So, it's somewhat interesting. Obviously, it just came out. I just got home from work. I'm dug into it a little bit. Wanted to go ahead and get a video out just because looking through the table of contents on it just kind of was like, wow, and exciting. And reading the introduction is very interesting as well. So, okay, so what we're going to go through here is I'm going to basically scroll through a large portion of the table of contents on it so that we can see kind of all the, basically the bullet points of everything she intends to talk about. And then we're going to go through a chunk of the introduction where she is actually pretty much kind of explaining what the main points are, what the main discoveries she's made are, and the main things that were done incorrectly in the first place. And and all about Ken Kratz and the way, basically the press conference, ignoring avenues of investigation purposefully and all that. It's all in here, so we'll move into those documents now. And like I said, it's just going to be a portion at the beginning of what she filed today. I will obviously be reading it, and I'll get back with a more in-depth video by this weekend, but just wanted to go ahead and give people an idea of what's in it, and it's pretty exciting stuff. So here we go. All right, so here's where we're going to start with her motion. Is part of the way through the table of contents here, where she talks about the ineffectiveness of Stephen's counsel originally. Well, I think that's mainly just her saying that they failed to examine this, which is what she has examined, and basically opening the door for her to bring her experts in. But among the things that she's pointing out, they didn't bring in the right kind of blood spatter experts to determine the fact that the blood in the RAV4 was not actually planted from the vial. Failure to demonstrate to the jury that the key was planted, and that it was a sub key and not a main key. They exceeded the scope of their search warrants by getting the groin swabs. The groin swabs were beyond the scope of the warrant. The hood latch story was completely fabricated by Wiegert and Fassbender after obtaining the confession from Brendan. And so then it goes on. And then law enforcement failed to investigate Teresa Halbach's background and see that she was at an elevated risk of becoming a victim of violence. Which leads into what we see here where, anyway, it gets down here where it's talking about the killer's postmortem activities to conceal evidence and frame Mr. Avery. The killer, and not law enforcement, planted Mr. Avery's blood in the RAV4. The killer planted the bones and the electronic devices. The killer knocked out the RAV4 parking light while he was trying to plant it at Mr. Avery's property. Basically, also, there's only one suspect that fits Denny, that fits all three criteria for Denny, and that basically is going to be Mr. Hillegas. Mr. Hillegas intentionally misled investigators. He got into her voicemail box. Scent tracking dogs show that the vehicle was moved onto the Avery property. Mr. Hillegas's activities after she died. Trial defense counsel fails to investigate the correct timing of Colburn's dispatch call. So lots of things here. Failure to construct the correct timeline of Mrs. Halbach's activities. Failure to construct a proper timeline for Mr. Avery's activities. Failed to detect the voicemail deletions, which I'm not sure they did detect it, but they didn't quite get at it quite well enough. Investigate and request DNA testing of items recovered at the Maribel Caves Park. Veracity of the police reports regarding Joshua Redant. Veracity of the police reports regarding Paul Metz. He's the guy who smelled the foul-smelling fire over on Xander Road. Trial defense failed to investigate evidence of a possible burial site. Failure to locate and interview witnesses who observed the RAV4 being driven onto the Avery property by the way of the Redant pit prior to November 5 of 2005. Brady violations, withheld zipper or voicemail CD which contained favorable exculpatory evidence for Mr. Avery. Investigators concealed the amount of gas remaining in Teresa's tank in her RAV4 from defense counsel. The flyover video was edited to conceal that the RAV4 was not present at the Avery property before 6 p.m. on November 4th. And on it goes, but new scientific evidence demonstrates that the bullet FL in Mr. Avery's garage was not shot through Miss Halbach's head, causing her death as the state contended. Micro trace examination of damaged bullet fragment with 2016 stereo microscopy, digital video microscopy, and scanning electronic microscope and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy demonstrates that the damaged bullet was never shot through Ms. Halbach's skull. And then it goes through her experts that will be talking about that and proving that. And then when it comes to source testing of the DNA that was planted of Mr. Avery that was on the key and violated Mr. Avery's due process rights, fabrication of evidence at trial by Mr. Kratz. So here's where she goes into Kratz about the confession being fabricated, the press conference, the charges against Mr. Avery were based on Brendan's confession, and Brendan was never even testified, if you remember. So Mr. Kratz engaged in fraudulent conduct. Mr. Kratz's statements destroyed Mr. Avery's due process rights to receive a fair trial. He attempted to introduce uncharged, unproven, or irrelevant prior conduct of Mr. Avery. Destroy Mr. Avery's reputation to prevent him from receiving a fair trial. An ongoing effort to do that, by the way. Mr. Kratz's presentation of inconsistencies and irreconcilable theories, which I believe in wholly. Let's give a big hand to that one. Anyways, Mr. Kratz's request for aiding and abetting instruction in Mr. Avery's trial, unprecedented, unethical, dishonest, and fraudulent activities of Mr. Kratz, uncanny parallel between Mr. Kratz's prior unethical behavior and current unethical behavior. Mr. Avery's post-conviction motions do not procedurally bar him from bringing this claim. Prior post-conviction attorneys were ineffective in their presentation to the trial court of evidence allegedly meeting the Denny standard. Mr. Avery's prior post-conviction counsel was ineffective for bringing clearly weaker claims than current post-conviction counsel. Ineffective assistance of Mr. Avery's prior post-conviction counsel. Mr. Avery's prior post-conviction counsel were ineffective for failing to argue that Mr. Avery's due process rights were violated when Mr. Kratz presented a theory at Mr. Avery's trial that was inconsistent and irreconcilable with the theory he presented at Brendan's trial. All right, so now we're going to move into her introduction. At the filing of this petition, Mr. Avery has been locked up for 10,909 days for crimes he did not commit. Mr. Avery has been alive for 20,058 days, so over 54% of his life has been spent behind bars. Ms. Halbach's entire life spanned just 9,355 days. Of the 4,238 days that have passed since Ms. Halbach's murder, only 9 short days were devoted by law enforcement to identifying the alleged murderer, much less time than the average vacation time allocated in 2005 to the law enforcement personnel involved in the 9-day effort, leading to the arrest of Mr. Avery. Stated differently, of the 4,238 days that have passed since Miss Halbach's death, only 0.212% of those days have been devoted to finding out who killed her. Because the state did not need to establish motive, it did not spend any time trying to figure out why Miss Halbach was murdered. Both Mr. Avery and Miss Halbach are victims of a justice system whose success depends upon the integrity, competence, and devotion of judges, law enforcement, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. Both Miss Halbach and Mr. Avery have yet to receive justice. Miss Halbach has been all but forgotten in the rush to judgment to convict and maintain the conviction of Mr. Avery. Mr. Avery has not been forgotten but buried alive because those individuals who were supposed to save him from a second wrongful conviction failed. Mr. Kratz's theory of Mrs. Halbach's murder is one of the most preposterous tales ever spun in an American courtroom. If Mr. Kratz's theory were true, Mr. Avery is a true idiot savant. Mr. Kratz's first tale was as follows. Mr. Avery, the idiot, selects as his victim the only female with whom he had an appointment on the day of the murder. Mr. Avery, the idiot, selects his own bedroom for the commission of an incredibly bloody crime. Mr. Avery, the idiot, handcuffs Miss Halbach to his bed, sexually assaults her, slashes her throat, and stabs her stomach. He carries her lifeless body to the garage, placing her in and then taking her back out of the RAV4, puts her on a creeper, rolls her to his burn pit where he tosses her body into a bonfire. However, despite leaving a mountain of incriminating evidence, Mr. Avery the savant takes over and is able to level the mountain of evidence and remove all forensic traces of Miss Halbach in his trailer and the garage in a feat that is comparable to defying the laws of gravity or forensic science. Mr. Kratz, recognizing the plot flaw and having no forensic evidence placing Miss Halbach in Mr. Avery's bedroom or garage, and not having the cooperation of Brendan Dassey, decides to rewrite the script. Mr. Kratz's new script calls for Mr. Avery the idiot to re-emerge and shoot Miss Halbach twice in the head while she is lying on his garage floor. Mr. Avery, however, the idiot, except when he's the savant, leaves the magic damaged bullet with Miss Halbach's full DNA profile on his garage floor. Mr. Avery confirms this idiocy by flinging Miss Halbach into the back of her vehicle, undoubtedly to create a bloodstained pattern on the cargo door that would provide Mr. Kratz's blood spatter expert with a chance to display his own idiocy in misrepresenting the stain to fit Mr. Kratz's script. Not to be outdone, Mr. Avery the savant reappears and is able to remove his fingerprints and blowback blood on the gun and all the blood spatter on the garage floor, giving credence to the saying, even miracles take a little time. Mr. Kratz's next plot twist is to have Mr. Avery the idiot burn Miss Halbach's electronic devices in his own burn barrel, and selects the precise time to start the fire when his brother Avery's friend, Robert Fabian, drives up to Mr. Avery's burn barrel and smells the odor of the burning plastic. Then Mr. Kratz, apparently in a creative frenzy, has Mr. Avery the idiot burn Miss Halbach in his burn pit 30 yards from his trailer at 7 p.m., which will ensure that family members and visitors who drop by and witness this shocking scene will, of course, opt to watch Prison Break rather than to call the police. Mr. Kratz creates another plot hole when he has Mr. Avery the idiot leaving the body burning in plain view and driving the RAV4 with his accomplice, Brendan, riding shotgun to the southeast corner of the Avery property, where the car, past the crusher, where both the car and the body could have been crushed, and past the smelter, where the body could have been burned, without detection. Mr. Kratz, in an imaginative burst, has Mr. Avery the idiot selecting a parking place for the RAV4 on top of the ridge where it is sure to be easily spotted rather than hiding it in the midst of 4,000 other cars. Mr. Kratz, in a devilishly cunning fashion, has Mr. Avery the idiot place branches and a hood on the vehicle with the intent of concealing it, but because he parked the RAV4 facing the opposite direction from the other vehicles and leaves the logo of the cargo door tire plainly visible, he actually makes the vehicle more conspicuous. Mr. Kratz, in a barrage of plot errors, creates an incongruent tale that in which Mr. Avery, the savant, without wearing gloves, manages to not leave a single fingerprint in Miss Halbach's vehicle in the RAV4, while Mr. Avery the idiot deposits 6 drops of his blood on the front seats by the ignition and in the rear door jamb. Mr. Avery the savant, trying to save the day, manages to not leave a single drop of blood on the RAV4 handle, key, lanyard, hood prop, gear shift, steering wheel, or battery cables. To absolutely ensure that his DNA is linked to the vehicle, Mr. Avery the idiot locks the car and opens the hood latch so that his sweat DNA will be found on the hood latch, just in case the jury is smart enough to figure out that his blood was planted in the RAV4. With the hubris of a novice writer, Mr. Kratz, in a desperate effort to connect Mr. Avery to Miss Halbach's murder, has Mr. Avery the idiot hide Miss Halbach's sub-key in his bookcase so he can start the engine as necessary prerequisite to crushing the vehicle. However, Mr. Avery the savant knows that a key is totally unnecessary to crush a vehicle because it can just be picked up with a front loader and placed into the crusher. In another illogical plot twist, Mr. Avery the idiot removes Miss Halbach's DNA from the key, but yet uses his own toothbrush to plant an abundance of his own DNA on the key before hiding it in his bookcase. Mr. Kratz interjects a little science fiction into the storyline when he has Mr. Avery, the savant, cremate the entire body in his burn pit in a record 3 to 4 hours without a single family member detecting anything. After the body was burned, Mr. Avery the idiot left all the bones on top of the ash pile within sight of anyone and within reach of his dog, who would ingest bones which would be detected in his stool. Mr. Avery, the savant, burned the body in his burn pit in a world record of 3 to 4 hours to a point where 60% of the bones completely disappeared and all but 2 teeth evaporated. Mr. Avery, the idiot, picked out some of the larger bones and moved them to his sister's burn barrel and to the Manitowoc gravel pit. As Albert Einstein once said, the difference between stupidity and genius is that genius has its limits. One would never imagine being convicted on such an idiotic theory, but Mr. Avery was. To understand how this happened, one must examine the other side of the coin, the performance of Mr. Avery's trial defense counsel. The state relied upon the following items of forensic evidence that allegedly linked Mr. Avery to the crime: Mr. Avery's blood in the RAV4, Mr. Avery's DNA on the hood latch, the electronic components, camera, Palm Pilot, and cell phone in Mr. Avery's burn barrel, the bones and remnants of Miss Halbach's clothing in Mr. Avery's burn pit, the Toyota key in Mr. Avery's bedroom and with Mr. Avery's DNA, and Miss Halbach's DNA on the damaged bullet found in Mr. Avery's garage. The state convicted Mr. Avery on this ludicrous theory because trial defense counsel only had 2 experts to combat the state's 14 experts. Trial defense counsel, by not carefully reviewing the discovery and not having the appropriate experts, failed to realize the following. Mr. Avery's groin swab had been substituted for the hood latch swab by law enforcement. The key discovered in Mr. Avery's bedroom was a sub-key and was planted by Lieutenant Lincoln Sergeant Colburn immediately before its discovery. Miss Halbach's voicemail messages had been deleted by the killer to keep her voicemail box open and to delay her family and friends realizing that she was missing. Miss Halbach's last appointment was at the Zipperers, not at the Averys. She left a message on the Zipperers answering machine that was concealed or destroyed by the state to mislead the jury into believing Miss Halbach's last stop was the Averys. The fuel level in Miss Halbach's car was concealed by the state so that the mileage that the vehicle had been driven on October 31st could not be determined, thereby preventing Mr. Avery from arguing that Miss Halbach's vehicle had been driven many more miles after it had left his property. Miss Halbach was at a higher risk for being a victim of violence because of her involvement in nude photography and her affair with a married man and with her ex-boyfriend's best friend. Miss Halbach's ex-boyfriend was verbally and physically abusive to her during their relationship. Miss Halbach's ex-boyfriend had sustained visible injuries to his hands from fingernail scratches around the time of her disappearance. Miss Halbach's ex-boyfriend initially gave the police a false name, minimized his relationship with her, lied about crime scene evidence, controlled and led the searchers to Miss Halbach's vehicle, had unrestricted access to the Avery property to plant evidence, assisted law enforcement in locating her car, and was living in her house after her murder in the complete control of the evidence disseminated to law enforcement from her personal papers and effects. So there you have it, folks. Ryan Hillegas. I will be leaving a link to my video below. Okay, folks, so that was about it. That was our little look right there. A little, kind of a tiny little peek into what Zellner filed. Just kind of a little overview with the table of contents there. A lot of interesting things. Obviously, I'm going to go ahead and read this and come back with a more, comprehensive video. But I just wanted to go ahead and get this out there real quick because, man, there's some really seriously exciting stuff there. I hope everybody else is as, happy about it as I am. And if you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you guys later. Obviously, the link for my Ryan Hillegas video and the link to this paper, to this filing, I will leave in the info below. Okay? See ya.